My stepson's eyes dropped to my chest. I pretended not to notice. But then everything changed. I thought it was just a glance. Harmless. But something shifted in the air that morning. A silence too loud. A gaze too heavy. And me, standing still. Pretending I didn't feel it burn. After the divorce, I thought I'd feel free. Instead, I felt displaced. Like I'd been erased from a role I didn't even audition for. The retreat cabin was supposed to be temporary, just a place to clear my head while the lawyers finalized everything. But as days passed, the silence grew heavier, not lighter. It pressed into my skin like the dampness in the wood-paneled walls. Mornings were the worst. The stillness was almost too sharp. I'd wake early, make coffee, and sit by the window watching nothing in particular. No voices, no footsteps, just birds I didn't care to name and the slow grind of my own thoughts. There were no more texts from Richard. No, "Are you okay?" No accidental calls. The man who once held my waist like I was the center of his world had vanished without resistance. I wasn't surprised. We had both been fading long before the papers were signed. I tried to tell myself this was healing. Space. Time to reset. But truthfully, I felt invisible. Not in a tragic way, just quietly irrelevant. Like wallpaper in someone else's memory. I hadn't worn a dress in weeks. I hadn't done my hair in even longer. There was no reason, no audience, no mirror I liked enough to perform for. Sometimes, I'd forget how old I was. I'd catch my reflection and look for the woman I used to be, the one who still believed in touch. In eye contact that meant something. But she never looked back. It was peaceful, yes, but peace has a way of disguising loneliness until someone walks in and breaks it. And that someone would arrive sooner than I expected. The knock was soft, almost polite. I opened the door to find Logan standing there. Duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Hoodie half-zipped. Curls damp from the morning mist. "Hey," he said, eyes not quite meeting mine. "Dad said I could stay for a bit." I blinked. Richard hadn't mentioned it, or maybe he had. In passing, I stepped aside. "Come in, you're soaked." He smelled like pine and road trip snacks. He dropped his bag near the fireplace and looked around. "Cozy," he muttered. I watched him take in the room like it was too small to hold him. He'd grown taller, broader. The last time I saw him, he still had acne and mumbled through every sentence. Now, he moved with the silent confidence of someone used to being looked at. "Kitchen's there, bathroom down the hall," I offered. I don't know why I felt awkward. It was his father's cabin. Technically. We didn't say much that day. I made grilled cheese, he ate too. He thanked me with a nod, then disappeared into the guest room with his headphones. I told myself it would be temporary. 1 week, maybe 2. The next morning, I wore a dress I hadn't touched in months. Soft cotton, faded blue, nothing special. I slipped it on without thinking, maybe because the laundry hadn't dried. Maybe because it smelled like the old version of me. I was pouring coffee when I sensed him behind me. "You look nice," he said casually, like it meant nothing, but his eyes lingered, too long, and lower than they should have. I froze, not because of what he said, but because of the way he said it. His tone wasn't boyish. It was measured, intentional. I looked down, pretending not to notice. But something had shifted. And once it shifts, it doesn't shift back. From that morning on, I became aware of Logan in a way I hadn't before. Not because he was trying, but because I was trying not to. He didn't flirt. He didn't push. If anything, he seemed almost detached, as if he were simply existing around me. But something about his presence made the silence feel louder. He'd come into the kitchen while I was wiping down the counter and reach over me for a glass. His forearm brushing mine, just long enough to notice, never long enough to accuse. Or he'd sit at the dining table, one leg bouncing, scrolling through his phone, while I made coffee and pretended not to watch him out of the corner of my eye. One afternoon, it rained hard. Thunder cracked through the trees, shaking the windows. I lit a few candles in case the power went out. Logan appeared in the doorway, holding a folded blanket. "You cold?" he asked. I shook my head. No, just the storm. He nodded and sat across from me. For a long time, we said nothing. The only sound was the rain pelting the roof and the steady drip from the gutter outside. Then, without looking up, he said, "You don't talk much." I glanced at him. "Neither do you." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Guess we're both good at hiding." I wanted to ask what he was hiding, but I didn't, because I already knew what I was. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, the storm fading into distant rumbles. I kept replaying the way his eyes had rested on me that morning. How he hadn't looked away quickly. How I hadn't wanted him to. And that terrified me. The next morning, I found a sketchbook on the coffee table. I picked it up, curious. It wasn't hidden, just left there, like a casual afterthought. The first few pages were rough landscapes, then faces, and then a woman. Hair tucked loosely, neckline curved softly, expression unreadable. It was me. Drawn not from memory, but from watching. I should have closed the sketchbook. Should have placed it back on the table and walked away. But I didn't. I flipped back to the page with the woman who looked too much like me. The curve of the jaw, the line of the collarbone, the half-shadowed eyes. It wasn't just resemblance. It was study, focus, attention. He hadn't drawn me by accident. My hands trembled slightly as I set the book down, but I said nothing when Logan walked in moments later, rubbing his eyes from sleep. He noticed the sketchbook still open. His gaze landed on the drawing, then slid to me. There was no panic in his face, just calm, controlled. "You weren't supposed to see that yet," he said softly. Yet, that word echoed longer than it should have. "I didn't mean to intrude," I whispered. He shrugged. "You didn't. You were always going to find it." And then he walked into the kitchen, just like it was any other morning. But nothing was ordinary anymore. Not after that. I spent most of the day avoiding him, tucking myself into corners of the cabin that felt safer. Quieter. I reorganized a drawer that didn't need it. Folded clothes that were already folded. But my thoughts wouldn't settle. They kept circling back to the way he'd said, "You were always going to find it." Like this had been inevitable. Like it was a story we were already in. Not one I still had time to step away from. That night, I sat on the porch alone, wrapped in a blanket. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees like whispers in a language I didn't understand. When Logan came outside, I didn't turn to him. I just stared ahead. "I don't want to make things weird," he said, voice low. "You already did." He didn't argue, just let the silence grow until it nearly swallowed us. Then, quietly, "It's not about how you look, Elaine. It's how you don't know you still do." I closed my eyes. Those words shouldn't have mattered. But they did. They hit a place that hadn't been touched in years. I got up and went inside before I could say something I'd regret. But I couldn't unhear it. And I couldn't unknow that he saw me, not as a stepmother. As a woman. It happened on a Tuesday. The kind of overcast afternoon where time felt stuck somewhere between morning and night. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for soup, trying to stay ahead of the silence that had returned to stretch itself across the walls. Logan had barely spoken to me that day, and I told myself that was for the best. Distance was safer. But when he entered the room, barefoot and quiet, the air changed. It thickened. I felt it before I saw him. "Smells good," he said, leaning against the counter. I kept my eyes on the cutting board. "It's just soup." He stepped closer, too close, reached around me to grab a spoon from the drawer. His arm brushed mine. I froze. Then his voice, low, too low. "Do you always do everything perfectly?" I didn't answer, couldn't. He set the spoon on the counter, fingers lingering for just a second too long. "You don't even realize it, do you?" I finally looked up. "Realize what?" "That you still take up space," he said, "that someone might actually notice." I stared at him, words caught in my throat. And then he stepped in, just a breath between us. His eyes searched mine, not for permission, but for confession. His hand reached up, almost touching my cheek, but stopping just short. I didn't move. He leaned in, slowly, as if to give me every chance to back away. But I didn't. I didn't even blink. His lips were inches from mine when a knock. Sharp, sudden. I jolted. He stepped back fast, jaw tightening. I didn't have to ask who it was. It was Monica, my friend. She'd mentioned dropping by this week to check on me. I had forgotten, or maybe I'd wanted to. I wiped my hands quickly and rushed to the door, heart pounding against my ribs like it wanted to escape. She stood there smiling, holding a grocery bag. Thought I'd bring you some fresh herbs. I forced a smile. Perfect timing. Behind me, Logan had already vanished down the hall, as if he'd never been there at all. But the heat on my skin hadn't left. The soup was still simmering, but everything else inside me had boiled over. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying it all, not just the almost, but what it meant that I hadn't pulled away. I didn't know what scared me more, that he'd nearly kissed me, or that I'd let him. The days that followed blurred together, stitched by tension and a kind of unspoken withdrawal neither of us acknowledged. Logan avoided me, but not completely. He still passed through the kitchen in the morning, still grabbed coffee, still muttered things like, thanks, or, sleep okay. But the space between us had shifted. Not wider, just charged. I pretended to be okay. I folded towels, swept the floor twice a day, watered the plants that didn't need it. I left the windows open longer than necessary, as if fresh air could undo what had almost happened. But I felt him watching. From doorways, from behind his mug, from the hallway mirror when he passed behind me, and I hated how I noticed. One morning, I found a note tucked under my mug. His handwriting. I meant it, all of it. No signature, no explanation, just enough to make my chest tighten. I threw it away. Then later, I pulled it back out. That afternoon, Monica returned, unannounced. She looked around the cabin like she was casing a scene. Her eyes lingered a little too long on the hall that led to Logan's room. You've redecorated, she said lightly. Feels different. I nodded, trying to make it feel like mine again. She smiled, but something about it didn't sit right. And then she pulled out her phone. Funny thing, she said, you left this voice message the other day. Blank. But I swear I heard someone in the background, breathing. I went still. She laughed it off. Probably nothing. But the way she watched me said otherwise. That night, I stood in the kitchen alone, staring at the hallway where Logan had disappeared. The weight of too many glances, too many what-ifs, settled on my shoulders like frost. Something had shifted. And now, someone else might have noticed. Logan left on a Friday. No announcement, no drama, just a suitcase by the door, a quiet knock on my bedroom wall, and a soft voice that said, I'm heading out. I didn't ask where, I didn't ask why. We both knew the reasons were already living in the silence between us. I met him at the threshold, arms folded tightly against my chest, trying to mask the storm inside me. He looked tired, not from lack of sleep, but from holding back, the same kind of tired I saw in my own reflection every morning. Thanks for letting me stay, he said. I nodded. Be safe. We stood there for a second too long. Long enough for the words we couldn't say to crowd the air between us. And then, he leaned in, not for a kiss. Not for anything reckless, but to rest his forehead gently against mine. It lasted just a moment, but it spoke louder than anything either of us had ever said. Then he stepped away, just like that. The door closed behind him with the softness of a secret. I didn't cry, not at first. I cleaned the kitchen. I opened every window. I washed the sheets in the guest room. I told myself this was closure. That I'd done the right thing. That I'd held the line. But that night, when the house had fallen completely still, I found something tucked under my pillow. It was the sketch, The same portrait from weeks before. Only now, he'd redrawn the eyes. This version looked directly at me, bold, knowing, sad. The caption below it was scribbled in pencil. Not your son, not your mistake. My breath caught. I clutched the paper to my chest and sat in the dark for what felt like hours. I never heard from Logan again. No texts, no missed calls, just silence, the kind that didn't press against me anymore, but echoed from somewhere I couldn't touch. Monica stopped coming around after that. I never asked why. I didn't want to know how much she had seen, or guessed. Richard never brought it up either. But his lawyer called 2 weeks later, proposing a settlement that was suspiciously generous. Almost like he didn't want anything dragged into the light. Some nights, I lie awake staring at the ceiling, listening to nothing, no breathing from the next room, no quiet footsteps at 2 a.m., just me, and the memory of being seen. Really seen. I keep the sketch in a box under my bed, not because I want to remember, but because I can't let myself forget. And sometimes, when the wind moves through the trees just right, it sounds like a knock on the cabin door. And I wonder, if it was him again, would I be strong enough to walk away this time?